That's exactly what's happening right now in a case linked to Nancy Guthrie. New surveillance footage has surfaced, and what it shows doesn't match what we've been told. The timestamps, the locations, the people captured on camera, none of it aligns with the version of events that was presented to the public. And for those who have been following this case closely, for the investigators who never stopped asking questions, for the family members who never stopped pushing for answers, this footage feels like the moment they have been waiting for. But here's the thing. The more you look at this new evidence, the more questions begin to pile up, not just about what happened, but about who knew what and when, about whether the full truth was ever really told. Because Nancy Guthrie's story is not simple. Her life was not simple, and the circumstances surrounding this case are far more layered than most people realize. So before we talk about what this new surveillance footage actually shows, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand who Nancy Guthrie really was, what her life looked like, what she meant to the people around her, and why this case, even years later, still refuses to be closed. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew. Nancy Guthrie is not a name that trends on social media. She is not a celebrity in the Hollywood sense. She did not walk red carpets or give interviews on morning talk shows. But within the communities that knew her, within the circles of people whose lives she touched, Nancy Guthrie was someone who mattered deeply. She was known as a woman of quiet strength, the kind of person who showed up, who remembered birthdays, who checked in on neighbors, who carried a warmth that made everyone around her feel seen. People who knew Nancy describe her the same way, almost every time. They say she had this ability to make you feel like the most important person in the room, that no matter what was going on in her own life, she made space for yours and her own life. It was complicated. It was layered. It was full of both beauty and pain, the way most real lives are when you look closely enough. Nancy had built something meaningful over the years. She had roots. She had relationships. She had a history in her community that ran deep and genuine. But she also had struggles that most people never saw. Private battles, quiet heartbreaks, tensions that simmered beneath the surface of a life that, from the outside, looked relatively ordinary. And that's what makes this case so haunting, because when something went wrong, when the circumstances around Nancy Guthrie first came to light, the people who loved her were not entirely surprised that things had gotten complicated, but they were devastated by what that complication had cost her. The case drew local attention. It drew community concern. It drew the kind of grief that settles into a neighborhood and doesn't leave quickly. And then it seemed to go quiet. Investigations stalled. Questions went unanswered. The public version of events felt incomplete to those who were closest to the situation. But without new evidence, without something concrete to push things forward, the case seemed headed toward that painful place where so many cases end up unresolved, unforgotten, and unfinished. Until now, because new surveillance footage has emerged, and the timeline it suggests is fundamentally different from the one that was officially presented. This is the story of Nancy Guthrie, and it is a story that is far from over. To understand what happened to Nancy Guthrie, you have to understand where she came from. She did not grow up with advantages. Her early years were marked by the kind of instability that leaves marks on a person, not always visible, but always present. Her family moved frequently when she was young. Financial pressure was a constant undercurrent in the household, the kind of stress that children absorb even when adults try to hide it, the kind that teaches a child early that security is not guaranteed, that you have to hold tight to what matters because things can disappear. And yet Nancy, by all accounts, did not become hardened by this. If anything, those early experiences seemed to make her more empathetic, more attuned to the struggles of others, more determined to build something stable for herself and the people she loved. She worked hard from a young age. She was the kind of person who didn't wait to be handed things, who understood, at a bone-deep level, that effort and persistence were the only currencies that reliably paid out. She pursued her education with that same quiet determination. She built friendships that lasted decades. She was loyal, sometimes to a fault, a quality that served her beautifully in some relationships and burned her in others. Those who knew her in her younger years often say the same thing. Nancy had a light, but she also had wounds. And sometimes the people who carry the most light are also carrying the heaviest things in private. As she moved into adulthood, Nancy found her footing in ways that felt genuinely hard-won. She established herself in her community. She built a life that had real texture and real meaning. But the old instabilities had a way of resurfacing. Old patterns, old relationships, old pressures that never fully resolved themselves. And it is in that context, that complicated, deeply human context, that the events leading up to this case begin to take shape. Nancy Guthrie was not famous, but she was important. And in many ways, that distinction matters more. Over the years, she became a fixture in her community in ways that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. She was the person people called when they needed help navigating something difficult, when they needed someone to sit with them in a hard moment, when they needed a voice that was steady and clear. She had become, organically and without fanfare, someone that others depended on. This gave her life a kind of purpose that she clearly valued. You can see it in how people describe her, not just with sadness, but with a specific kind of reverence. The reverence you reserve for people who genuinely showed up for you when it cost them something. Nancy also had her own ambitions, her own dreams, her own sense of where she wanted her life to go. She was building toward something, quietly, persistently, in the way she did everything. And for a time, it seemed like she was finally getting there. But what happened next changed everything. No life unfolds in a straight line, and Nancy Guthrie's life, for all its warmth and intention, had significant points of tension that began to accumulate in ways that concerned the people closest to her. There were relationship difficulties that became increasingly difficult to ignore. There were situations and people in her life that, in hindsight, carried warning, signs that feel obvious now but were murky and complicated. In real time, few people knew the full extent of what Nancy was navigating. In the period leading up to what happened, she was not the kind of person to broadcast her struggles. She was the helper, not the one who asked for help. And that particular quality, that ingrained tendency to carry things alone, meant that the people who loved her often didn't understand how serious things had become until it was too late. There were moments when she reached out, quiet signals in conversation and behavior that something was wrong, that the pressure she was under was reaching a level that felt unsustainable. But those signals were easy to miss if you weren't looking for them, and not everyone was looking. The circumstances surrounding what eventually happened to Nancy are still being pieced together. But what is clear is that in the weeks and months leading up to the events in question, Nancy Guthrie was a woman under significant strain, navigating a situation that had grown more complicated and more dangerous than most people around her realized. Behind every public narrative is a private person, and the private Nancy Guthrie was someone who felt things deeply. She loved fiercely. She grieved fiercely. She forgave in ways that sometimes surprised even her closest friends, sometimes wisely, and sometimes at great personal cost. She had the kind of heart that made her remarkable to be close to, but that same heart made her vulnerable in ways that were sometimes difficult to protect. She had hopes for her future that were specific and personal, not grand or abstract. She wanted peace. She wanted stability. She wanted the kind of quiet, grounded life that had eluded her in different ways throughout her years. She talked about these things with the people she trusted, about wanting to feel safe, about wanting the noise and tension and uncertainty to finally settle into something solid. The cruelty of what happened is amplified by how close she seemed to actually getting there. Those who knew her best say that in certain moments, even in the most difficult stretch of her life, Nancy still had that light. She still smiled in ways that reached her eyes. She still made people feel important and seen. She was still, in every meaningful sense, fully herself. And that is what makes the questions around her case so urgent, so personal, so impossible to simply set aside. This is where the story becomes something more than a personal narrative. This is where the investigation enters the picture, and where the cracks in the official account become impossible to ignore. When authorities initially outlined the timeline of events in Nancy Guthrie's case, it appeared straightforward enough on paper, a sequence of events a logical progression from one point to the next, but investigators and advocates who examined the details carefully noticed inconsistencies early on her witness accounts that didn't align with the stated timeline, locations that didn't match, a sequence of events that, the more you examined it, required an uncomfortable number of assumptions to hold together. At the time these concerns were noted but not resolved, the investigation moved forward on the basis of the existing timeline. The case was treated as settled, or close to it, but some people never stopped asking questions, and those people are now pointing to the newly surfaced surveillance footage as the most significant development in this case in years. The footage came from a location that had not been considered a primary point of interest in the original investigation, a camera that had been running, that had captured something important, that had not been reviewed, or not reviewed thoroughly enough at the time when it could have most significantly shaped the investigation's direction. What it shows is this: Nancy Guthrie appears on camera at a time and in a location that directly contradicts a key element of the timeline presented in the official account of her case. If the footage is authentic, and those who have seen it believe it is, then the sequence of events as publicly understood cannot be accurate. The timestamp places her somewhere she was not supposed to be at that point in the timeline, in the presence of circumstances that raise immediate and serious questions about what was actually happening in the hours surrounding the critical events in her case. This is not a small discrepancy. This is not a minor clerical inconsistency. This is a fundamental challenge to the version of events that has served as the entire foundation of the official account. Investigators and legal advocates who have reviewed the footage are being careful with their language. They are not drawing conclusions that the evidence hasn't yet supported, but they are making clear that this footage needs to be taken seriously, that it demands a formal, thorough review, that the questions it raises cannot simply be set aside. For Nancy Guthrie's family, and for those who have never stopped pushing for answers, the emergence of this footage is both a moment of painful validation and a renewed call to action. They always believed the full truth had not been told. Now they have something concrete to point to. Cases like this one are not just about facts and evidence and legal processes. They are about people. They are about what it means when someone's story gets flattened into a simplified version that serves convenience rather than truth. About what happens when the systems designed to deliver justice move too quickly or not carefully enough. Past evidence that deserves far more attention. Nancy Guthrie was a real person with a real life and real people who loved her. Her story is not a statistic. It is not a case number. It is not a file that can be quietly closed because closing it is easier than reopening it. The people who carry her memory have carried something heavy for a very long time. The uncertainty, the incompleteness, the feeling that something important was missed or ignored, and that she deserved better than what she got. What this new footage represents, beyond its specific evidentiary significance, is a possibility that matters deeply. The possibility that incomplete stories can still be made whole, that new evidence can still surface, that the truth has a way of being persistent, even when it has to wait. Nancy Guthrie was not famous, but she mattered, and the people who mattered to her refused to let her story end with a question mark. There is something profound about that kind of love, the love that keeps showing up, that keeps pushing, that refuses to accept an answer that doesn't feel complete, even when pushing costs something, even when it's exhausting, even when it would be so much easier to simply let it go. This new surveillance footage is not the end of Nancy's story. If anything, it is the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the full truth might finally have a real chance to emerge. We owe it to her to pay attention. We owe it to ourselves, and to the idea that truth matters, to make sure that the questions this footage raises are answered fully, carefully, and with the kind of honesty that Nancy Guthrie's life and memory deserve. She deserved that in life. She deserves it now.